The cold found him first. Not the biting air in the barn, but the chill coming off the small, still form half buried in a drift of snow against the northern wall. Owen had been heading out for the final check on the livestock, the lantern light cutting a weak, yellow path through the pre-dawn gloom. He saw the gray of her dress first, a smudge of wrongness against the white. He stopped. His breath plumed, a fleeting ghost in the beam. Every instinct, honed by years of solitude and the quiet observation of a dangerous land, screamed caution. But the stillness of the shape pulled him forward. He raised the lantern higher. It was a woman. Her face was turned away, dark hair spilling across the snow, stark as spilled ink. He knelt, the cold of the ground biting through his denims. He touched her shoulder. She was light, fragile under the coarse fabric of her worn dress. He felt a faint tremor, the barest signal of life. He moved with an economy born of necessity, sliding one arm under her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her from the frozen ground. She weighed almost nothing. As he stood, her head lolled back, and the lantern light caught the side of her face. She was young, Chinese, with features made sharp and desperate by cold and fear. Her eyes fluttered open for a second, dark and deep, with a terror that was old and bone deep, before they slid shut again. He carried her toward the cabin, his own boots crunching a steady, rhythmic protest against the silence. The cabin door opened with a familiar groan, and he brought her into the single room, the sudden warmth from the banked fire in the hearth making the air feel thick. He laid her gently on the cot he used as his own bed, the rough wool blankets a stark contrast to her pale skin. He worked quickly, his movements precise. He stoked the fire, adding logs until it blazed with a steady, consuming heat. He filled a basin with warm water from the kettle, the steam rising to fog the small window pane. He returned to her side and began the grim work of assessment. Her hands were raw, scraped and bleeding. One ankle was swollen, twisted at an unnatural angle, but it was when he gently pushed back the sleeve of her gray dress to check her pulse that he saw it. There, on the delicate skin of her inner wrist, was a mark. Not a scar from an accident, but a deliberate brand, a series of numbers seared into her flesh. A claim, a debt. It was the mark of a man's ledger, a sign that this woman was not considered a person, but property. A cold, hard anger, an emotion he thought he had buried deep beneath years of silence and isolation, began to smolder in his gut. He had seen marks like that before, from a distance, in a life he had tried to leave behind. He covered her wrist again, his touch more gentle than he intended. The fight wasn't out on the plains. It had come to his door. He pulled a chair close to the cot and sat, the rifle he always kept ready leaning against the wall nearby. He would wait. He would watch. The fire popped and hissed, the only sound in the room, a small defiance against the immense, predatory cold outside. She woke slowly, not to the world but to the sensation of warmth, a feeling so foreign it was a shock. For a long moment she lay still, her eyes closed, trying to place the scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee, the solid weight of wool blankets over her. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to rise in her throat, the muscle memory of waking up in the wrong place. She forced it down. Her body was a map of pain, a dull throb in her ankle, a stinging fire in her hands, a deep ache in her bones that spoke of days of running. She opened her eyes. The room was small, clean, and sparse. A man sat in a chair by the fire, his back to her. He was large but not looming, his stillness a kind of anchor in the quiet space. He seemed to be mending a piece of leather, his hands moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm. He must have sensed her gaze, because he stopped his work and turned his head. His eyes met hers. They were clear, gray as a winter sky, and held no malice she could see, only a deep, settled weariness. Lynn pushed herself up on her elbows, a gasp escaping as a sharp pain shot up her leg from the swollen ankle. The man stood and came to her side, holding a tin cup. "Easy now," he said. His voice was low, rough around the edges. "Just water. You're safe here." Safe. The word was a language she no longer understood. She took the cup, her scraped hands trembling slightly. She drank, the cool water a balm on her parched throat. He watched her, his expression unreadable. "My name is Owen," he said, not as a question but a simple statement of fact. She said nothing, her own name a secret she guarded like a weapon. He didn't press. He just nodded and returned to his chair, picking up his work. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire. Hours passed. He brought her a bowl of thin broth and she ate it, the warmth spreading through her. She watched him move about the cabin, his efficiency speaking of a life lived alone. He never moved too quickly, never made a sound that wasn't necessary. He was a man who had learned to take up as little space in the world as possible. Finally, as dusk began to bleed purple and orange at the edges of the window, he spoke again. "You were running hard. Who from?" The question was gentle, but it landed like a stone. Lynn's gaze dropped to her hands, to the wrist he had surely seen. "Finch," she whispered, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. She saw his hands stop their work. She looked up and saw the change in his face, a tightening around his jaw, a shadow that passed through his eyes. He knew the name. Of course he knew. Everyone in this territory knew of Mr. Finch and his mining operations, his company towns, his contracts that were nothing more than chains. The silence that followed her answer was heavier than before. It was a silence of recognition, a silence of complicity. He had not just heard the name, he had seen the work of the man who owned it, and he had done nothing. Owen set aside the harness he was mending, the leather feeling slick and foreign in his hands. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the vast, empty expanse of snow-covered land that he had once mistaken for peace. It wasn't peace. It was a hiding place. He could feel the young woman's eyes on his back, her gaze sharp and questioning. He owed her more than broth and blankets. He owed her the truth. He turned from the window, the dying light casting his face in shadow. "I used to haul supplies for Finch," he said, the words feeling like stones being pulled from his throat. 10 years ago, before I bought this place." He watched her face for a reaction. There was a flicker of something, contempt, maybe disappointment, but mostly just a weary kind of resignation. She had expected no better from the world, or the men in it. The admission hung in the air between them, thick as smoke. "I hauled timber for the mine supports, tools, food for the company store. I saw the camps. I saw the men and women working the lines. I saw the guards on the fences." He paused, forcing himself to meet her gaze, to let her see the shame that he had carried like a secret weight for a decade. "I saw the look in their eyes, the same look you had when I found you. And I kept my head down. I took Finch's coin, and I looked away." He did it. He said the words. He named his cowardice. He had told himself it was just a job, that it wasn't his business. He had told himself he was saving for this land, for a life of quiet dignity. But that dignity was built on a foundation of willful ignorance, and he knew it. Lynn's voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet but brittle, each word a shard of ice. "Everyone looks away," she said. It wasn't an absolution. It was an accusation, aimed not just at him, but at the entire world that allowed men like Finch to flourish. "They look away when the contracts are signed with marks instead of names. They look away when the debt grows faster than the wages. They look away when people disappear into the mountain and never come out. Looking away is easy." Her anger was a clean, pure thing. It was not the wild, panicked fear he had seen in her eyes before. This was a righteous fury, honed and sharpened by injustice. It was the anger of someone who had been treated as less than human and had never for 1 second believed it. It was a fire, and Owen felt it burning away the last of his carefully constructed excuses. That was then. This is now. The thought was not a comfort, but a command. He had spent 10 years trying to outrun the memory of those faces behind the fences. And now, one of them was in his home, her wound a testament to his failure. The debt he owed was not to Finch, but to her. Not any more, he said, the words a vow made to her, and to the man he had failed to be for so long. Not from this house. Not from me. The days that followed were a fragile truce with the world. The winter deepened, sealing them inside the small cabin, a pocket of warmth against the vast, indifferent cold. Owen tended to Lynn's ankle, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle as he changed the bindings. He said little, but his actions spoke a language of penance. He cooked for her, simple meals of salted meat and beans, ensuring she ate first. He kept the fire roaring, a constant battle against the drafts that snaked through the old log walls. Lynn, in turn, began to slowly let down her guard. She watched him, her eyes missing nothing. She saw the way he paused before stepping outside, his gaze scanning the horizon, a habit so ingrained it was like breathing. She saw the tension in his shoulders when a gust of wind rattled the cabin. He was a man living on a precipice, and she understood that she was the one who had pushed him there. She started to help in small ways, her pride refusing to let her be a helpless burden. She sat by the fire, her injured leg propped up, and mended his worn shirts, her stitches small and neat. One afternoon, as she worked, she finally offered him her name. "It's Lynn," she said, her voice quiet. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her, a real look, one that saw past the fugitive and the victim. "Lynn," he repeated, testing the sound of it. "It's a good name." A tentative trust began to build in the spaces between words, in shared glances across the flickering lamplight. She told him, in fragmented pieces, about the mine. Not about the cruelty, he already knew that, but about the small acts of defiance. The songs whispered in their own language when the guards weren't near. The extra piece of bread shared with someone weaker. The small, stubborn ways they had held on to their humanity in a place designed to strip it from them. He listened, his silence an invitation for her to speak, to reclaim the story that Finch had tried to erase. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, piling snow against the door, a sense of intimacy settled over the cabin. The world was shut out. There was only the fire, the howling wind, and the two of them. He had been cleaning his rifle, a nightly ritual. She watched his hands, strong and capable. "You are not like them," she said suddenly. He looked up, his expression questioning. "The men who work for Finch," she clarified. "Their hands are quick and cruel. Yours are slow, careful." He set the rifle aside. "A man's hands show his history," he said. "Mine built this place, mended fences, cared for animals. For a long time I thought that was enough, that building a good life for myself was a moral act." He looked at her, his gaze direct, vulnerable. "I was wrong. A life can't be good if it's built on turning your back to the suffering of others." In that moment a subtle shift occurred. The space between them was no longer just about protector and protected, guilt and anger. It was about two people, isolated by circumstance, finding a shared sliver of understanding. He saw not just a runaway, but a woman of incredible resilience. And she saw not just a man with a guilty past, but one who was willing to burn his comfortable life to the ground to finally do what was right. The air grew thick with unspoken things, a longing for connection, a fragile hope for a future that wasn't defined by running or hiding. The foundation of something soft and new was being laid, right there in the heart of the storm. It started with a sound, faint at first, almost lost in the ever-present moan of the wind across the plains. But this was different. It was a rhythmic, percussive beat, muffled by the snow, but unmistakable to a man who had spent his life listening to the land. Hoofbeats. Owen froze, a piece of firewood halfway to the hearth. He set it down without a sound and moved to the window, peering through a small section he'd scraped clear of frost. For a long time there was nothing but the vast, empty white. Then he saw them. 2 riders, black shapes moving slowly against the horizon, their progress methodical, inexorable. They weren't passing by. They were coming for him. For her. He turned from the window, his face a grim mask. Lynn was watching him, her mending forgotten in her lap. She had heard it too. The animal instinct for danger was sharp in her. She didn't need to ask. She could see the answer in his eyes. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady. "2 for now," he said. He walked to the heavy wooden door and slid the thick bar into place, a gesture that felt both necessary and woefully inadequate. The cabin, which had been a sanctuary, suddenly felt like a trap. He looked at her, the choice laid bare between them. "There's a root cellar," he said, his voice low and even. "The entrance is hidden under the floorboards. They'd never find you. I can tell them you were never here, that I saw you heading east." It was the sensible option, the safe option, the one that would allow him to retreat back into his quiet, solitary life. It was the coward's way out, and they both knew it. Lynn's gaze was unwavering. She looked at the barred door, then back at him. She had been running her whole life. She was tired of running. She pushed herself to her feet, testing her weight on her healing ankle. It held. "And what will you do when they leave?" she asked. "Wait for them to come back with more men? Wait for Finch himself to ride out here and burn this place to the ground for lying to him?" She was right. There was no hiding from a man like Finch. You could only delay the reckoning. He had bought himself 10 years of delay, and the bill was finally coming due. He offered the last option, the one that had been sitting in his heart since the moment he saw the brand on her wrist. "Or," he said, the word hanging in the air, heavy with consequence, "we can stand, right here. We can draw the line." Lynn held his gaze, a long, searching look. He saw the fear in her eyes, but underneath it was a core of hard, unbending steel. She had survived Finch's mine. She would not be broken now. She gave a single, sharp nod. The choice was made. A strange sense of calm settled over Owen. The gnawing guilt, the years of looking over his shoulder, it all fell away. There was only the present moment and the simple, terrifying clarity of what must be done. He walked to the fireplace and took the heavy rifle from its pegs above the mantel. He didn't check it with any flourish. His movements were practiced, familiar. He simply confirmed it was loaded. He was not a gunslinger, not a fighter by trade. He was a rancher. This rifle was a tool, meant for coyotes and mountain lions. Today it would be used to keep a different kind of predator from his door. He handed a small, heavy pistol to Lynn, who took it without hesitation. Her hands were steady. They stood in the quiet of the cabin, armed and waiting, the sound of the approaching horses growing louder, a slow, deliberate drumbeat counting down the final moments of their peace. The hoofbeats stopped. A profound silence fell, broken only by the snorting of horses and the creak of leather as the riders dismounted. Owen stood just inside the door, the rifle held loosely in his hands, its weight a familiar burden. Lynn was positioned near the window, out of sight from the outside, the pistol held firmly in both hands. He could hear her steady breathing, a small, courageous sound in the tense quiet. Then, a voice, laced with an easy, unearned authority. "Owen, we know you're in there. This is Sheriff Brody. Come on out. We just want to talk." The lie was so bald it was almost insulting. Owen remained still. Let them wait. Let them feel the cold. After a minute, the voice came again, sharper this time. "Don't make this difficult. We have a warrant for retrieval of property belonging to Mr. Alistair Finch. A signed contract. It's all legal and binding." The word property was a slap. Owen felt Lynn tense behind him. He unbarred the door and opened it just enough to step out onto the porch, pulling it shut behind him. The cold hit him like a physical blow. Sheriff Brody stood in the yard, a portly man whose uniform was stretched tight over his belly. His face was florid, his expression a mixture of impatience and smug certainty. Beside him stood another man, thin and sallow, with the dead-eyed look of someone who carries out another man's cruelty for pay. This was Finch's man. "Sheriff," Owen said, his voice flat. His gaze did not leave Brody's. "You're a long way from town." Brody gestured dismissively with a gloved hand. "Business for Mr. Finch is town business, you know that. We have it on good authority that his missing asset is here. A young Chinese girl. Just hand her over and we can all go home and get warm." "There's no asset here," Owen said, his voice dangerously quiet. "There's a young woman in my house. A guest. And she's staying." Brody's folksy demeanor evaporated. His eyes narrowed. "Now listen here. That girl is under contract. She broke it. That's theft. You're harboring a thief. That makes you an accomplice. The law is very clear on this, Owen. You're on the wrong side of it." "The law," Owen repeated, the words tasting like poison. "Your law says a piece of paper is worth more than a person's life. Your law says a man can own another human being as long as he calls it a debt. That's not law, Brody. That's a convenient lie for rich men." Finch's man took a step forward, his hand drifting toward the pistol on his hip. "He's got a lot of nerve, Sheriff." Owen shifted the rifle slightly, a small, deliberate movement. "This is my property," he said, throwing Brody's word back at him. "And you're not welcome on it. Get back on your horses and ride away." Brody laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You think that rifle scares me? You're one man. We have the law. We have Finch. What have you got?" He took another step, his hand now resting on the butt of his own gun. The yard was a stage, the snow-covered ground a stark backdrop for the moral confrontation. It was one man against a corrupt system, a standoff built not on bullets, but on two opposing definitions of justice. The moment stretched, thin and brittle. It was about to break. Just as Brody's hand tightened on his pistol, a new sound cut through the tension. A lone rider approaching from the west. The man was old, wiry, sitting atop his horse with the easy slump of someone who had spent a lifetime in the saddle. He wasn't riding fast, but he was riding with purpose. Brody and Finch's man turned, their irritation plain. The rider was Abner, whose small ranch bordered Owen's property to the west. He pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of the yard, staying clear of the direct confrontation but making his presence known. He had an old shotgun resting across his lap. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Afternoon, Sheriff," Abner said, his voice a dry rasp. "Just checking on my neighbor. Seemed a bit crowded over here for a winter's day." Brody's face flushed a deeper red. "This is official business, Abner. Stay out of it." "Official business looks a lot like bullying from where I'm sitting," Abner retorted, his eyes sharp and clear under a bushy brow fixed on Brody. "Last time you had official business out this way, young Thomas from the Miller place went off to work for Finch. His mother's still waiting for a letter." The mention of the name hung in the air, a specific and damning accusation. Finch's man shifted his weight, uncomfortable. Intimidation worked best in isolation. It faltered under the gaze of a witness. Before Brody could formulate a response, another figure appeared on the low ridge to the east. A woman, Martha, who ran a small farm with her husband. She just stood there, a dark silhouette against the gray sky, her arms crossed, watching. Then another. A farmhand named Samuel, who had worked for Finch for one season before quitting, his face still holding the memory of it. One by one they appeared, silent figures on the periphery, the small, scattered community of ranchers and farmers, people who usually kept to themselves, separated by miles of hard land and a culture of self-reliance. They had seen the sheriff and his man ride out. They knew where they were going, and they had made a choice. They didn't ride in with guns drawn. They didn't shout threats. They simply arrived. They stood and they watched. The witness crowd. Their collective presence was more powerful than any weapon. It was a silent, unassailable judgment. Brody's blustering authority began to crumble. He was the law, but the law drew its power from the consent of the governed. And in that frozen yard, consent was being withdrawn. The power had shifted. It had moved from the two armed men representing a distant wealthy tyrant to the quiet, determined people standing in the snow, their faces hard with the memory of 100 small injustices, now refusing to look away. The wall of silent judgment was absolute. Sheriff Brody looked from Abner's shotgun to the stoic figures on the ridge, his face a mask of sour disbelief. These were the people he was supposed to control, the quiet, compliant folk who tipped their hats and paid their taxes. Today they were something else. They were a community, and their collective gaze was a force he could not bully and could not arrest. Abner spoke again, his voice carrying easily in the cold, still air. "That contract you're so proud of, Sheriff, was it written in a language she could read? Did she understand the interest rates? Or was it just another page of lies to trap someone who had nowhere else to go?" His questions were surgical, cutting through the pretense of legality to the rotten core of the matter. From the ridge, Martha's voice, clear and strong, rang out. "My brother worked a season for Finch. Came back with half the wages promised and a cough that took him before the next winter." Another man spoke, his voice thick with anger. "Finch's company store charges twice what they charge in town. You work for him, you owe him more at the end of the week than when you started. It ain't a job, it's a cage." The testimony chorus had begun. Each statement was a small, hard truth, another stone added to the wall of defiance. These were not abstract complaints. They were personal wounds, shared histories of exploitation that had been whispered in private for years. Now they were being spoken aloud, in the open, for the law to hear. The weight of their shared experience was suffocating Brody's authority. He was no longer a sheriff enforcing a contract. He was a company man defending a predator against his neighbors. Finch's hired man looked nervously at Brody, his confidence gone, replaced by the unease of an outnumbered animal. He was paid to intimidate the weak and isolated, not to face down a unified front. This was not in his job description. Brody knew he was beaten. He couldn't arrest them all. He couldn't shoot them all. To escalate the violence now would be to ignite a fire he couldn't control, and Finch valued profit, not open warfare. With a final, venomous glare at Owen, he spat on the ground. "This isn't over," he snarled. It was a hollow threat. He had lost control of the narrative. The law he represented had been exposed as a tool of oppression, and the people had refused to honor it. He turned without another word, swung himself heavily onto his horse, and spurred into a trot, his man scrambling to follow. They rode away, their departure an ignominious retreat, their backs conveying a defeat more profound than any physical surrender. The figures in the yard and on the ridge remained for a long moment, watching them go, ensuring the threat was truly gone. Then, slowly, with quiet nods to Owen, they began to disperse, melting back into the landscape as silently as they had appeared. They had drawn a line in the snow, not just for Lynn, but for themselves. The silence had been broken. The quiet that descended on the ranch after they left was different. It wasn't the silence of isolation anymore, but the deep, resonant silence of a battle won, of a community that had found its voice. The cold air felt cleaner, sharper. Abner rode his horse into the yard and dismounted, his shotgun now resting in the crook of his arm. He walked onto the porch where Owen still stood, the rifle hanging from his hand. Abner's weathered face broke into a rare, thin smile. "Figured you could use some company for coffee," he said, his tone dry as ever. Owen finally allowed the tension to leave his shoulders, a long, slow exhale of breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I reckon I could, Abner. I'm in your debt." "No debt," Abner said, clapping a hand on Owen's shoulder. "We're all in it together now. Always have been. Just took us a while to remember it." He looked toward the cabin door, which had opened a crack. "This ain't over, son. A man like Finch, he don't forget a slight. He'll send more than Brody next time." Owen nodded, his gaze steady. "I know. But next time, we'll be ready." Abner nodded, satisfied, and after a shared cup of coffee, he rode off, leaving Owen alone once more. The door opened fully, and Lynn stepped out. She was wrapped in one of his thick wool blankets, but she didn't seem to feel the cold. Her eyes were shining, not with tears, but with a fierce, brilliant light. She looked at the horizon where the riders had disappeared, then at the tracks in the snow left by their neighbors, their allies. She looked at Owen. She didn't say thank you. The words would have been too small for the magnitude of what had happened. Instead, she moved to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm. They stood together on the porch, a silent vigil in the fading light. The boundary between his private world and the public one had been crossed, and there was no going back. He felt a profound sense of rightness, a peace that had eluded him for 10 years. The guilt was gone, burned away by action. He looked down at her, at the strength in her profile, the proud set of her jaw. He felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it startled him, but it was mingled with something else, a deep, abiding admiration. He noticed she was shivering, a slight tremor running through her. Without thinking, he shrugged off his heavy sheepskin coat and draped it over her shoulders. It swallowed her small frame, but she pulled it tighter, leaning into the warmth and the faint scent of leather and wood smoke that was uniquely his. She didn't pull away. She leaned into him slightly, a small, trusting gesture that spoke volumes. In the shared warmth of the coat, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, the fragile connection that had formed between them deepened, solidifying into something strong and true. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time the future felt like a promise, not a threat. That evening the cabin was filled with a warm, peaceful light. The fire crackled, the stew Owen had made simmered on the hearth, and the wind outside seemed less like a threat and more like a distant memory. The violent tension of the afternoon had given way to a profound sense of release. Lynn sat in the chair by the fire, her face soft in the flickering light, the exhaustion of her long ordeal finally settling upon her. She had eaten her fill, a quiet gratitude in her eyes, and now she was simply watching the flames, a small, genuine smile on her lips. Owen watched her, feeling a contentment he hadn't known was possible. This small, sparse cabin had become a home in a way it never was when he was its sole occupant. Her presence had filled the empty spaces, not just in the room, but in him. As the hour grew late, her head began to nod, her body finally succumbing to the need for rest in a place where she felt, perhaps for the first time in years, truly safe. Her eyes fluttered shut, and she murmured something, her voice thick with sleep. "I can sleep in my boots." It was a heartbreaking admission, a glimpse into a life lived on the edge, always ready to flee at a moment's notice. Survival had been ingrained so deeply it had become part of her subconscious. Owen's heart ached for her. He stood and walked over to her chair, kneeling before her. She was almost completely asleep, her breathing deep and even. He looked at her worn, scuffed boots, the laces frayed, the leather cracked. They were a symbol of her hardship, of her relentless journey. He reached out, his calloused hands moving with infinite care, and began to unlace the first boot. His touch was so gentle that she didn't stir. He worked the stiff leather, easing it off her foot, then did the same with the other. He set the boots aside, a small, final act of defiance against the life that had been forced upon her. "Rest easy tonight, beloved," he whispered, the endearment slipping out, unbidden but utterly true. The word hung in the warm air, a quiet revelation. He loved this brave, resilient woman. He stood, and with the same care he had shown her wounds, he gently lifted her from the chair. She was light in his arms, her head resting against his chest, a soft sigh escaping her lips. He carried her to the cot which he had piled high with his warmest blankets, and laid her down, pulling the covers up to her chin. He stood over her for a long moment, watching the peaceful expression on her face, a sight he now knew he would defend with his life. He turned and banked the fire for the night. He picked up his rifle, not with fear, but with a renewed sense of purpose. He walked to the door, slid it open, and stepped out onto the porch, into the cold, clear night. He sat in the chair, the rifle across his lap, and began his watch. The threat of Finch was still out there, a shadow on the horizon. But tonight, Lynn would sleep without her boots on, and he would stand guard, a protector not by reluctance, but by choice, by love. The fight had just begun, but for the first time he knew with absolute certainty that it was a fight they would win.